Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the St. Louis Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today for joining us for today's program, an artist talk with Jess T. Dugan, whose exhibition is now on view at the museum through February 20th, 2022. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. To get us started, I will hand things over to Eric Lutz, the Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and Hannah Clem, the museum's Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, who will introduce our featured speaker. Thanks, Hannah and Eric.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So it is my pleasure indeed to introduce the photographer Jess Dugan. Jess is known for their color portraits, exploring the power of identity, desire, and personal connection. They received their MFA in photography from Columbia College Chicago in 2014, their Master of Liberal Arts and Museum Studies from Harvard University, 2010, and their BFA in photography from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in 2007. They have built quite an impressive resume, and in a relatively short amount of time, I would add. Dugan's work has been widely exhibited and is in the permanent collections of many major museums, including the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the International Center of Photography, where they were also the recipient of the prestigious Infinity Award in 2019. In the last 7 years, they've had more than 30 solo shows in museums and galleries, and quite a few more group shows. Dugan's monographs include To Survive on the Shore, photographs and interviews with transgender and gender nonconforming older adults, 2018, Every Breath We Drew, 2015. They're currently working on a new book to be released by Mac Publishers in the spring of 2022. This upcoming book will include all of the works on display in the current exhibition now on view. On sort of a more personal note, I would say that I really couldn't be more excited about the work that is on display, and the fact that through the Freund Fellowship, we are able to give such wonderful representation of the St. Louis LGBTQ community in the space of the St. Louis Art Museum is, I think, very significant. And more broadly, that Jess's work so eloquently draws out the need for connection in all of its manifestations, physical and emotional, as friends, as partners, as members of a community, which is heightened by the fact that this work was both created and presented during a global pandemic that affected all of our relationships. Well, that's quite something, and that's quite something to celebrate, I think. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hannah Clem, co-curator of the exhibition.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jess, for being here and for such a wonderful exhibition. As Eric mentioned, Jess served as the 2020 to 2021 Henry L. and Natalie E. Freund Fellow, a long-standing collaborative fellowship between Washington University's Sam Fox School of Art, Architecture, and Design and the St. Louis Art Museum. The fellowship has been around for over 25 years, and it has two parts. First, Jess taught graduate students at the Sam Fox School over the course of the 2020 to 2021 academic year. And then the fellowship culminates in this fantastic Currents exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum. I would like to thank Michael Freund for his continued support of the Henry L. and Natalie E. Freund Fellowship, as well as our colleagues at Washington University's Sam Fox School, without whom this wonderful collaboration wouldn't happen. Carmen Colangelo, the Ralph J. Nagel Dean of the Sam Fox School, Patricia Olenek, the Florence and Frank Bush Professor of Art, Lisa Bolowski, Professor and Chair, MFA in Visual Arts, and the Director of Island Press, and Amy Haupt, Director of the College and Graduate School of Art. I'd also like to thank the students and the administrative support at the Sam Fox School, who always really help out a lot during this time. And now I will pass it on to Jess.
All right. Thank you, Hannah. I got to make sure I'm not muted here. Okay. You can all hear me. Thank you, Hannah and Eric and Jessica for those wonderful introductions. Before I jump in, I'm just going to repeat a few of the thank yous that Hannah said. But first and foremost, I want to thank the St. Louis Art Museum and specifically you, Hannah and Eric. It's been a total dream to work with you so closely on this exhibition. And I couldn't be more excited about how it turned out. So thank you for all of that. And of course, to all of the other people at the Art Museum. I know it's a massive team who made this happen. So thank you to everyone at the museum. And I also wanted to thank Michael Freund for his support of the Freund Fellowship. I had a fantastic year working with the students at Washington University and really loved that experience. And also wanted to thank everyone at WashU for their support, especially Lisa Bulowski, who I worked with very closely. And then finally, I want to thank all of the subjects in the exhibition. Of course, this work wouldn't exist without them. So, and I want to thank all of you for joining us on a beautiful Saturday morning. I'm impressed that this far into the pandemic, we have such a big group still consensually using Zoom. So thank you for being here with us online this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my practice as a whole with you this morning, starting with some earlier influences and early work, and then walking you through 3 primary projects. And I will, of course, speak about the work that's on view at the St. Louis Art Museum, but I will situate it within my larger practice. There we go. Okay. So this is me when I was 8 years old, and I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, looking very similar to how I look today. And from a very, very early age, it was reflected back at me that there was something about my gender presentation, something about my identity that was not what was expected of me. That was not how a, quote unquote, little girl was supposed to behave. And so I grew up with this incredibly heightened sense around my identity, but also the ways in which our personal identities affect our experiences in the world. And I like to start my artist talk with this image because, excuse me, because so much of my work comes from my own identity and my own place in the world. And this is really an important touchstone. Can I ask Hannah or Jessica, can you see the control bar at the top of my screen? Is that distracting?
No, we can't see it.
You can't see it. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that interruption. Just wanted to make sure. Okay. So this is me at 16. This is my high school prom photograph. I had moved from Arkansas to Cambridge, Massachusetts with my mom when I was 13, and I came out as gay when I was 13. I started questioning my gender identity shortly thereafter. I was not at all a school dance kind of person. I had never been to one. I was an angsty art student and wasn't overly interested in these kind of rituals, but I was also very politically involved with some local LGBT nonprofits and with activism at my high school. And largely as a political gesture, I ran for prom king. And my photography teacher, Archie LaSalle, covered the photography classroom in signs of support, and it was incredibly sweet and touching. And long story short, I ended up winning prom king. And so I, out of necessity, had to go to the prom, which I hadn't fully thought through. So this is my photograph from that time. And again, I put this in to show that my identity has always been politicized. And I've always chosen to embrace that politicization and embrace activism around that. When I was coming out around this time, around 13 and 14, I didn't see a lot of images of people who looked like me in mainstream media, in television shows. And so I went looking for representation. And the first places that I encountered images of queer folks and gender nonconforming folks was in fine art photography books. And this representation was hugely influential to me. I imagine most of you are familiar with Catherine Opie, who was an important early influence to me. I discovered work like this, the Drag King book by Della Grace Volcano with writing by Jack Halberstam. And when I was putting this talk together, I pulled my copy of the book off the shelf and realized that Dell had signed it to me in 2004. And I've never said this publicly, but now I'm going to. When I was coming out, I was trying on different names. So this book says For Joey. Obviously that didn't stick. But I found work like this. I found images that I could relate to. I found images of butchness and female masculinity and queerness. And this was incredibly validating to me as a queer person and also as an early artist. I also found books like this on the left, Reframing's New American Feminist Photographies. I'm pretty sure this is actually where I discovered Catherine Opie's work. And in this book, I found work by a lot of female artists who were making work that was socially and politically engaged. And this really set me on the path for what I wanted my work to be as an artist. And then the book on the right, of course, is more contemporary. It's from 2013, but I put it in because I feel that if I was coming out now, if I was 14 today, I might find this book as a kind of parallel. So these early experiences, thinking about representation and how representation can really validate an identity, were incredibly important to me and very influential. So thinking about a couple other influences, this is me at 14. I wanted you to have a visual of the person who these influences were acting upon. I discovered photographers like Diane Arbus, Lauren Cameron, who worked within trans communities early on, Dorothea Lange, specifically her portraiture, Robert Mapplethorpe around images of queerness, and of course, August Sander, who remains a significant influence for me in terms of portraiture. And then I was also seeking representations in other places. I was reading work by Leslie Feinberg. I was really influenced by Stone Butch Blues. I was reading work by Ivan Coyote, watching films like Better Than Chocolate, which is a little cheesy, but was important to me as a teenager. And of course, you know, things like Boys Don't Cry came out during that time. And so I was seeking representations in the world around me. One thing that was notable is, you know, even thinking about Leslie Feinberg and Boys Don't Cry, Better Than Chocolate, a lot of these representations centered around trauma or tragedy or violence against a queer body. So even the representations that I was finding were limited in their scope. Switching gears just slightly, I finished my undergraduate degree at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in 2007, and I got a job at the Harvard Art Museum. I worked in the collections management department, and I photographed art 8 hours a day for several years. I photographed primarily old prints, old master prints, and I was surrounded by the work in the museum. I was just there all the time, early in the morning, late at night, kind of quiet in this space. And the aesthetic of painting, and in particular, old master painting and portrait painting, really seeped into me. And you'll see that that is also a significant influence in my work. So I'm going to show you a few of my earliest images to give you a sense of kind of how my practice formed. These are some of my early photographs. I was around 18 making these. I was learning to use a 4x5 view camera, which for anyone unfamiliar, it's the kind you know, it's big, you put it on a tripod, you have your head under the dark cloth, it's slow and collaborative. And so I was learning to use that camera, and I was just making pictures. I wasn't conceiving of these as a project or a body of work, but the reason I put them in and why I like to think about them is when I look at them, I can see very clearly my interests, and they've remained consistent from the beginning until now. And for me, those are an interest in people. I've always been drawn to make portraits. And specifically, I'm interested in making portraits that go beyond the exterior to talk about a more interior emotional and psychological experience. And then I'm also thinking about how we read really complicated ideas about identity and gender and sexuality through things like gesture and through things like clothing. And so for me, all of that is present in this early work, even though I probably didn't have the language to think about it that way at this early stage. When I was 18, I had chest reconstruction surgery to align my body more closely with my internal gender identity. I use the language of non-binary today. And that's how I've always identified, although the language has changed many times between 2005 and now. And after that experience, I wanted to photograph myself. I have always used my camera as a way to understand myself and what I'm going through, to understand my body, to understand how I relate to other people. And so this is the first image I made after my surgery. It's me standing next to my mom. And I wanted to capture this moment. I wanted to capture her support of me, her involvement through this process. I wanted to start to understand my body. And this was a really important early picture for a couple of reasons. It was the beginning of me photographing myself, which you'll see continues to this day. I have a long practice with self-portraiture. It was the beginning of me making work with my mom, which I'll also show you more of that. And then it was the beginning of my first real body of work, which I called Transcendence. And I was living in Boston at the time. I was part of a very active LGBTQ and transgender community. And again, thinking about ideas of representation, I hadn't seen a lot of images of the trans community and trans people that were positive or complicated or humanist. Everything I was seeing was either highly sexualized or fetishized, overly negative, centered around violence. And so I began to make portraits of my world and my community and my friends that were more complicated, that were more intimate, that were more humanist. And so this was my first significant body of work as a younger artist. And then around 2010, I switched to working in color, and you'll see that this switch has remained consistent since then. And at the same time, I decided to focus specifically on people within the transmasculine community, meaning people who were assigned female at birth and transitioned to some other point along the gender spectrum. And I did this because I felt that it was the experience I was most closely aligned with. It was the community I was most intimately a part of. And it felt like the experience I could speak about the most personally. It also led me to a broader interest in masculinity and the construction around masculinity, which you'll see reappears in later work. For a long time with my work within the trans community, I had avoided focusing on the physicality of transition because I felt that so many representations around transness only focused on the body, and I was interested in the psychology and the emotion. But at some point I realized I was leaving that out as well. So this is a friend of mine, Mick. We were traveling together and he was injecting his testosterone. And I made this image, and this image for me is important for a couple of reasons. One, it really fuses a classical style of photographing, a classical style of image making with a very contemporary subject matter, which is something I've continued to employ throughout my practice. And the second is that this, for me, is where I really see a significant influence of painting and thinking about light and thinking about color and thinking about how I can use those elements very intentionally to control the emotion and the psychology of a particular image. This is a self-portrait from 2011. I had a revision on my chest surgery. And again, I photographed myself immediately after, both as a way to understand myself, but also because I've always felt really strongly that it's important for me to share my story. I ask a lot of my subjects, the people that I photograph, I ask them to share themselves with me. And I have found that by sharing my own story and being really open about that, it makes space for other people to share with me. And also I want to include myself in the community that I'm photographing. That's another important aspect. This is Dallas from 2011. And this is an image of Dallas at the San Diego Museum of Art. This was an exhibition from the summer of 2012. And every summer the curators would interject the permanent collection with contemporary work. And so they placed my photograph of Dallas in this room with old master paintings and Renaissance portrait paintings. And the two here that you can see were called Anonymous Portrait of a Woman. And then on the other side of the room, you can't see it in this image, there were paintings called Anonymous Portrait of a Man. And so I really loved that they interjected this, these assumptions around the gender binary with my portrait of Dallas. And I also really loved that they linked my very contemporary practice of portrait photography with a much longer history of portraiture and art historical portraiture. So in 2011, I relocated from Boston to Chicago, and I began making the work that became Every Breath We Drew. I actually originally thought I was going to continue photographing for Transcendence. This is Dallas again. And I found some people to photograph. I made some portraits, and I realized very quickly that my interests had shifted. I was no longer interested in making work within one specific identity community or about one specific identity, but I had really become interested in the process we each go through to come to understand ourselves and our own identity, and then how we seek intimacy and connection with other people from that place. So I was trying to photograph something that was in some ways hard to photograph, but I began to think about different themes: intimacy and desire and connection, which I know Eric mentioned in the introduction and are really core themes in my work. So this body of work includes some literal self-portraits like this. This is one where I'm very actively projecting my identity out at the viewer. I'm pulling from, both art historical poses and also kind of, grinder, beefcake, gay poses, and playing with those two things and playing with notions around masculinity, and really projecting that out of the viewer and asking them to engage with me and question their own assumptions about who I am and what they see and how they feel about that. I had this photograph included in an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, and I gave a talk as part of that exhibition, and someone asked me a question that was essentially, how do you feel about being nude in the museum? And it was an interesting question because I flipped it back to them and basically said, that depends on how you read my body. If you read my body as masculine or male, then this is not nude. And if you read my body as female, then it might be considered nude. And I'm just really interested in those kind of conversations. There are still life images throughout this body of work. Again, I was thinking a lot about our need for connection and intimacy. A lot of the still life images have pairs of objects, which are a way for me to talk about this need for connection and relationship without showing a specific couple or specific people. This is me and my partner, Vanessa. We started making work together after we met in 2012. This is one of the earliest photographs, and you'll see this actually built out into its own body of work, which I'll show you in just a few minutes. Other pairs of things that are indexical to the human body that reference a relationship. And again, another literal self-portrait. In a way, this work as a whole functions as a self-portrait because the people that I'm drawn to photograph are people who I feel a pull to energetically. They're people who I'm drawn to spend time with. They're people who I see a quality in that I either have in myself or want to see in myself. So there's a really interesting and complicated kind of mirroring that happens with the subjects. So this work is highly personal. There's so much of me in this work, and the choice of who to photograph is really a significant part of this. So now I'm entering some of the more recent work that's on view in the exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum. Like I said, I was working on this since 2011. I published a book in 2015 of the earlier work. And then after that book, the work really started to shift for me. I started to move outdoors. I was thinking a lot about the body in the landscape, and that's something that certainly intensified during the pandemic. I was starting to photograph in really quickly changing light. I was situating myself outside at sunrise or sunset, both because I love that quality of light. I love the ethereal nature of it. I love the intense emotion. I love the way it renders color, but also because for me as a photographer, I felt that I had hit a level of mastery with portraits where I could go into someone's home, I could look around at the light, I could make a portrait that I could have imagined before I got there. And for me, I wanted to throw a wrench in my own practice and have to respond to the light and incorporate the light as a really significant element of the image. This is a still that's included in the exhibition at the Art Museum. I was not thinking about Richter when I made it, but of course there's that reference embedded in my brain. And again, I was thinking about stills and pairs of objects as a way to reference this need for relationship. It was interesting because I was making a lot of work for this exhibition right as the pandemic hit, and I was going full speed ahead, knowing I had the show, knowing I wanted to make new work, knowing I wanted to work with local subjects within St. Louis. And then the pandemic hit, and I really had to retool the way that I made photographs. I was accustomed to going into people's personal spaces, homes, spending time with them there. So one major shift for me is that I had to work outside exclusively. I didn't have the option of photographing inside. So again, that meant that I photographed really early in the day and really late in the day. And I quickly found out which of my friends will meet me at sunrise. There's a handful of you, maybe some of you are on the call, who have met me at 6 or 7 a.m. Or at sunset, like here with Calvin. And I started incorporating the landscape in a much more significant way. This is in Peevely, Missouri, but a lot of the work that I've made is in Tower Grove Park, where I live and spend a lot of time, in Forest Park. And I was always interested in seeking out, even in an outdoor public space, I was interested in seeking out a quiet, private space and moment. I'm always seeking a portrait that transcends the specifics of that particular moment to talk about a deeper experience of being human, a deeper experience of what this means. And during the pandemic, of course, I was thinking even more about ideas around connection and ideas around isolation and ideas around how we really need to be in relationship, to feel fully ourselves and fully human. So the shift to the landscape was one big thing that happened during the pandemic, and also for the exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum. Another thing that happened is I began making still life images, and you saw that I had already made some, the pillows and the jeans, and they existed in my practice, but I returned really intensely to them. And I was photographing flowers a lot. This was in my home. here in St. Louis. And I was really responding to the light. The light became a huge element in all of the work, and also to the color. And again, thinking about how I could use light and color to really harness a kind of psychology. And I was making these works as a way to process my experience of the pandemic, and as a way to kind of work through some of these existential questions that I think many of us were having during this time, thinking about life and death, and what it means to be alive, and what it means to be in relationship with other people. And so for me, over the past 2 years, my work really took a deeper dive into the emotional and psychological, even though that was already there in the earlier work. I think it intensified, and I think much of the work became more internal. This is a photograph of Shira, who's someone locally who I've photographed quite a bit. And I was really interested in this kind of quiet moment, this reflective moment. I'm also really interested in water. You'll see that there's water in a lot of my images, and I'm interested in the emotional quality of water, water as a metaphor. This was also a bit of a practical solution because, again, I wasn't photographing indoors at this point, and this was made in the fall, and I had to think about how to keep working in the fall and the winter in a way that still felt intimate. And so that led me to new kinds of locations. It led me to seek out different opportunities. I often work with the same subjects many times over a period of years. Colin is a really good example of that. He's local and is someone that I've photographed regularly since 2017. You'll see him several times. And again, thinking about color and light, also at some point during the pandemic and over the past couple of years, I started seeking out new locations and really intense locations in terms of color and light, and really being very deliberate about how these elements come together. I use a medium format camera. I work with my camera on a tripod. I work with all natural light. I have very slow shutter speeds. I spend a long time making a portrait. I spend anywhere between 1 and 2 hours making a portrait. So, I'm very much a photographer, but there's a lot of kinship with painting and how I intentionally pull in elements of color and light, in addition to the subject, of course. So that red portrait was made at the Angad Arts Hotel, which, if you're local, you might be familiar with. And that was the last picture I made before COVID. I made it on, I think, March 13th, 2020, and then everything shut down. And interestingly, Colin was the first person I photographed during COVID. We made this in the spring of 2020, obviously outside in Tower Grove Park, but he sort of bookended my experience of the pandemic. And these images are included in the exhibition. I was also thinking about bringing in organic elements outside. I showed you the flowers inside, but there are certain images from outdoors, again, asking larger questions about life and existential questions. This is Kai, another person I've worked with quite a bit. This photograph is included in the exhibition, made very early in the morning in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And again, playing with these kind of classical poses and having really subtle indicators around issues of identity. Another image of Kai, again, very early in the morning in Indiana, in the natural landscape. And another thing I've been thinking about, a lot of my earlier images were made indoors. And so as I've shifted outside, I've also been thinking about how queerness reads differently in a natural environment, or how queerness reads publicly versus in a private interior space. So that's been something on my mind as well. This is Zach and Oscar, another two people who I've been photographing really consistently over the past several years. They're in the exhibition at the Art Museum. Again, just thinking about ideas of intimacy and connection. This is Bill and Casey from Tower Grove Park. In a lot of my images, I use direct eye contact from the subject to the viewer. That has been shifting a little bit more in the recent work as I've gone more interior, but there are a couple of reasons I do that. One is that I feel that it really gives power back to the subject. It allows them to present themselves as they wish to be seen. And it also really activates the experience for the viewer. It requires that the viewer engage and that they have an intimate experience with this person, and that they can question their own assumptions around issues of identity, issues of gender and sexuality, and then it really forces them to be an active participant in the process of looking at the work. This is Andre from 2019. This is Apollo, also from 2019. This is in the exhibition. Another flower image from earlier this year. This is Shira and Sarah, one of my favorite photographs in the exhibition. And it's the one that's on the brochure and on the banners. And I really love this image. This for me is very much a result of the pandemic. I absolutely, if I had had my way, would have gone to their house to photograph them, and I couldn't. And so we sought out this location. This is a rooftop down on Broadway, for those of you familiar with St. Louis, and in the background is the Mississippi River. And again, we were photographing really late in the day. This was the very last moment before the sun dropped. And I was thinking a lot about, again, issues of identity and connection. I love how they're holding one another. I love how we can read into their identity through their poses, both individually and together. And again, this is really notable for me because it's a different kind of image. And it was something that came directly out of a limitation that ultimately was incredibly frustrating, because I had this plan to make a ton of work for this exhibition, and I had to retool that. But this to me was a really clear outcome of that felt very positive. So also there are other environmental shots and stills. Again, these for me are a way to have some quieter moments in the work, to have some moments of reflection. They reference the human body with the water glass and the pillow. But this for me is a way to go more inward, to go more poetic, to kind of create some space to think about the experiences that you see in the portraits. So the other shift that was really significant for me during the pandemic was an intense return to making self-portraits. And as you saw earlier, this has always been part of my practice, but it was a practical solution. I had access to myself, but it was also an emotional solution. I think I was processing my experience by making these images, and they're all, they're much more inward. My earlier work was about projecting my identity outward, and these are much more inward and psychological. As Eric mentioned, I'm working on a book, and I just made the edit, and there are 5 self-portraits in the book, and none of them have direct eye contact with the viewer, which is a really significant shift. A recent portrait of me and Vanessa that's included in the exhibition. And this is the most recent. This is from this summer. This is not in the exhibition, but only because I made it too late. I probably would have put it in otherwise, but clearly a reference to the earlier self-portrait and thinking about the passage of time. So this is the work in space. I'll show you some images at the Art Museum as well, but the scale of my work is really important to me. It's important that it's large enough that the viewer can have a very intimate interaction with it, but that it's not so big that it becomes larger than life. This is a recent exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And I put this in because I really love when my work is situated within exhibitions that are not specifically photography. So I'm particularly interested in the work in dialogue with other media. This is the exhibition at the Art Museum. I'm kind of going through clockwise how you would encounter the work. This is the first wall. And then, as you can see, there's a mix of scale. I hope many of you can see it in person. But I was thinking a lot about lyrically how these works flowed together, how the sequence worked, and thinking about creating an environment that as a whole added up to something really meaningful and more meaningful than any individual photograph. So I showed you the picture of Vanessa from Every Breath We Drew, and in 2012, after we met, I started photographing her repeatedly. And I originally thought this was part of Drew because I conceived of that work as being about identity and desire and relationships and connection. But I realized pretty quickly that this had become its own project. And at the same time, I was photographing my mom. I mentioned I've always made work with her, and she's been a significant part of my practice. And you know, interestingly, I wasn't really conceiving of this work as a project originally. It sort of slowly grew organically over time. And it's become what I'm loosely calling family pictures. It's a very long-term body of work. I don't anticipate, you know, exhibiting this work as a whole or publishing it anytime soon. It's something that I very much think of as requiring a lot of time to come together. But it's interesting for me for a couple of reasons. One is that, you know, technically it's a challenge as a photographer to photograph the same person over and over. I'm almost a decade into this, so that's been particularly interesting for me to pursue this over a long period of time. I also really love that it allows me to talk about things I'm interested in, like gender and identity and family and relationships and connection and all of these things, but it allows me to talk about it not by hitting it on the head, but through through the telling of a story about a specific relationship and a specific family and a specific experience. So that's something that I'm really drawn to, and I hope to continue this for a really long time. So my partner and I have a daughter. She's 3 now. And when Vanessa got pregnant, I began to photograph her because that's what I've always done. I've always documented my life and just kind of folded that in. This is a picture of us holding Eleanor when she was 2 days old. This is in the hospital, the first picture I made with her. We were incredibly sleep deprived, which I think, reads in the photograph. But, again, I was just thinking about this as my life and documenting my life. And in a very quick period of time, I showed the work to some curators and some friends, and I started to get feedback right away that reminded me that there's really a lack of representation around queer families and around queer parenting, and specifically around butch parenting or transmasculine parenting. And so, again, thinking about ideas of representation and thinking about where are the gaps and what is lacking. I'm very much conceiving of this work as something that is highly personal, telling my own story, but also filling that gap in a certain way, creating representations that are lacking, that we don't see a lot. And so, so that's very much on my mind with this work. Now that my daughter's 3, she's much harder to photograph, so I'm gonna have to change up my skill set a little bit. Again, I've been photographing my mom with her partner. This is her and her partner, Chris, in Provincetown. This is me and Eleanor again. This work hasn't been exhibited yet. The first exhibition will be next year at the National Portrait Gallery. There will be a small selection of this work in a larger show about family. But I'm really conceiving of it as something that needs another, 10 or 20 years to feel a bit more complete. This is Eleanor on the bed. Another self-portrait from during the pandemic. Eleanor in the backyard. And this is me and my mom. I've continued to photograph us together, and I'm particularly interested in thinking about how my relationship with my mom has changed as I've also become a parent, and thinking about simultaneously occupying that role of child and parent, and kind of being in the middle of those things. And definitely having a child has also changed my relationship with my mom and with my family in really interesting ways. And I'm interested to keep documenting that. This is the most recent picture. This is me and my mom from this past summer. So one other body of work that I've made with my mom, I'm going to show you very briefly. Since 2010, we've been making that same photograph that we made together in 2005, and we make one a year. And I'm really interested in pursuing this as something that documents the passage of time, documents our relationship. I'm thinking about aging and our changing bodies. And another thing that's become really wonderful for me about this work is when I made that first picture, my mom had no idea that it would be seen. I was very young, I was a student. And now she really knows that. And so when we come together every year to do this, it's not only her affirmation of my practice, but it's also a kind of annual affirmation of her support of me and our relationship, which has become really wonderful. So again, I hope to do this as long as I can. In 2017, I made an autobiographical video piece called Letter to My Father, again, continuing my interest in family. I actually originally made it for an exhibition here in St. Louis at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And in this video, I read a letter to my father, who I am estranged from, trying to understand our difficult relationship. So it traces my early gender nonconformity, which he was never comfortable with, through my search for masculinity, trying to figure that out. It looks at how I was kind of looking to my father for role models around, or a role model around how to be a masculine person, and how that always just ultimately failed and never hit the mark. It goes through my emerging queerness. This is me at 13, and that difficulty, through my relationship with Vanessa and our marriage, which was the beginning of the end of my relationship with my father, And then it bounces back in time to think about his experience being a parent, his experience with me, what his hopes and dreams may have been, and how that all kind of fell apart. So in a way, this is one of the most personal works I've ever made. It was really difficult for me to work on, but was ultimately very healing to put out in the world and to exhibit. So another aspect of my work with my family. So this is the third and final project I'm going to share with you today. It's called To Survive on This Shore: Photographs and Interviews with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Older Adults. And this was a project I made between 2013 and 2018. I actually worked on this project in collaboration with Vanessa, who is a social worker and an associate professor at Washington University. And her work looks at the intersection of LGBTQ communities and aging. So when we met, we realized we had all these overlapping interests, and we had both worked within trans communities. We were both interested in that. And she really brought me into the realm of aging, and I brought her into the realm of photography. So over a period of 5 years, we photographed and interviewed over 88 people throughout the United States. And from the very beginning of this work, we were really committed to seeking a diverse group of people. So we sought diversity in terms of age. Our minimum was 50. We didn't have an upper limit, but our oldest ended up being 90. We sought diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, gender identity and expression. So we were seeking people who existed on all aspects of the gender spectrum, including non-binary or genderqueer or whatever language that people used. We felt that that was really important to include. We also sought diversity in terms of socioeconomic status and geographic location. We went all throughout the United States, big cities, small towns, every major region. And then the final way we were seeking diversity was in terms of life narrative. So some of the people had transitioned quite early in 1970, 1971. Other people had transitioned in 2016 or 2017. Some people didn't transition for various reasons. So we were really interested in seeking as broad of a group of people as possible and capturing as many different kind of stories as we could. So again, we worked on this for a period of 5 years, and we finished this in 2018. So each person would share their story in an interview first. We would always conduct the interview first before making the portrait. And this was really helpful for me, both because it allowed us all to get comfortable with one another, but I also often learned things in the interview that I could incorporate in the photograph. So for example, Bobby had a long career in the military. Her house was full of planes and flags. And because of learning what I learned about her in the interview, we decided to incorporate that in the photograph. This is Jude, who at the time was 75, and he was actually someone who transitioned very early in 1971. And this is an image of him when he was 32. And it was interesting to hear layers of influence in the project, because a lot of the other people we spoke to referenced Jude as the first person they had ever known about, or the first person they had ever seen. So even within the project, there were intergenerational layers that were particularly interesting. This is Caprice in Chicago. This is one of my favorite images. And I'm pretty sure she had conceived of this entire scene before I showed up. She kind of art directed it in advance. And this is Grace. So most of the people in the project I met specifically for the project. There were a few exceptions of people I had known before. And Grace was actually someone I knew when I was a teenager. She's the executive director of the Boston Alliance of Gay and Lesbian Youth. And I had known her for a very long time. So I'm going to read you Grace's quote just to give you a sense of one of the quotes. Obviously, there's a quote for every person, but I don't have time to read them all. And then I'll just talk a little bit about how we made the project and how we got it out into the world. So Grace says, "I always felt more like girls, like women. Even when I was watching movies or television shows or reading books, the female characters were the ones that I identified with just sort of instinctively. So I knew I was born male, but I certainly was a feminine boy growing up, a genderqueer boy, and was harassed and bullied and got a lot of negative attention because of that. I was assumed to be gay from the earliest get-go as well, even though it wasn't talked about then in the 60s. So I was called all the names associated with that. Sissy, faggot, fairy, all of that. I didn't feel like I was transsexual. I didn't have that profound sense of body dysphoria that lots of transsexuals report, even though there were things that I wanted to change. So the way I understood that and was able to express that in the 80s was maybe what we would now call genderqueer. That term wasn't used then, but I lived in another gender space. I just was living in this third gender space. I didn't see it as on my way to anything. I've been lucky to have people in my life who have been supportive of me in my journey, wherever that would lead me. So it was less about giving me guidance on a specific path and more about people who have said, your identity is evolving and that's a wonderful thing. And we encourage you to explore that and go with that. I still see myself as on a journey. When I received an award a few years ago at a conference, I said, in the 60s, they called me a sissy. In the 70s, they called me a faggot. In the 80s, I was a queen. In the 90s, I was transgender. In the 2000s, I was a woman, and now I'm just Grace. So I love Grace's quote for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously it's really powerful, but one thing I love about it is that she really situates her own individual journey within a larger social and political and cultural shift, which was a really important aspect of this project that we wanted to record. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the making of the work. Like I said, we began in 2013. We started with people we knew personally, and it kind of spread word of mouth for a couple of years. In 2015, we started getting press for the work, including this feature in the New York Times, and this really exploded it on a national level. I got hundreds of emails from people wanting to participate. I was contacted by organizations wanting to bring me to their town. So this early press was really important to the making of the work. This is one of the first exhibitions. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And simultaneous with this museum exhibition, we organized a community exhibition at the Center on Halsted, which is Chicago's LGBT center. And for this work, this duality is really important to me. It's very important to me that this work is in a museum space because I feel very strongly about the importance of representation and about folks seeing themselves in the museum space. But it's also important to me that it exists outside of that space so that it's encountered by people who might not self-select to go into an art museum. We made a book in 2018 and sent one to all of the participants. And it was very sweet. As we sent it out, we would get all these pictures back. And I later learned that people know what page they're on. And we're just really excited about the book. So that was incredibly meaningful. In this work, you know, as opposed to my work in Every Breath We Drew, which is all about me in a lot of ways, this work was really not about me. It was about the participants, and I centered them in the making of the work, and then I centered them as well in the programming. So instead of doing traditional artist talks, when the book was released, we would organize panels with the participants to come and share their stories. So this is from Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. And then we also had a pretty significant press moment in 2018 when the work came out. It started with this feature in the New York Times and then went pretty viral from there. And that was an interesting experience for me because the work on a mainstream level was wonderful, but there was also some negative pushback. And so I really had to think through some of those ideas around my responsibility to my subjects and what that meant. This is the first solo exhibition of this work. This is here in St. Louis at Projects Plus Gallery. And whenever I have an exhibition, particularly for this work, but for all of my work, I view the exhibition as just the beginning. And I like to think about the ways in which I can involve the subjects. So we always involve people as much as we can. We're doing that at the St. Louis Art Museum show as well with some programming in January. So this is Steph from here in St. Louis. This is John, who's from a very small town in Arkansas. These were from the opening weekend. And then I also think about that in terms of programming. So I try to have as many educational programs as I can during the run of an exhibition. This is a visit from a social work class at Washington University. This is a program we organized in collaboration with 2 local LGBT nonprofit groups for trans and gender expansive folks to come and share their stories within the gallery space. And then this exhibition is traveling. So it's been at, I think, 6 museums thus far. This is at the University of New Mexico Art Museum in 2019. It's currently up at the George Eastman Museum in New York and will continue to travel from there. There are other iterations of the work. This is a recent exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and these works are actually all part of their collection. So they'll remain in the museum, which is really exciting for me. So this work had a significant educational and activist mission as well. So I created a limited edition portfolio of 12 photographs and texts. And this was designed specifically for teaching institutions. And there were 10 available. They've all been placed throughout the United States. They're used in study rooms, they're used in class visits, they're used in exhibitions. This is at the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore College. Sometimes institutions acquired the portfolio and then also mounted it as a solo exhibition. So this is at the Gregory Alakar Museum at Colorado State in Fort Collins. And then again, I wanted to take this work out of an art setting. So we created a community exhibition with the support of the Regional Arts Commission here in St. Louis for non-art venues. So this is at the Central Reform Congregation in the Central West End here in St. Louis. This is at Washington University School of Social Work. And then that exhibition is continuing to travel. So it's up at the University of Illinois right now. It was recently at the University of Denver. And so that will continue to travel as well. Again, thinking about this duality of having the work in a fine art museum space and also in community spaces where it can be encountered differently. And then the very last thing I'm going to share is that this work has an activist mission. So we've been collaborating with as many nonprofit groups as we can. This is a collaboration with Open House, which is an organization in the Bay Area that was working with LGBTQ seniors. And this poster was designed specifically to protest the removal of a question relating to sexual orientation and gender in the National Survey of Older Americans Act participants. So they were looking for images of older trans folks and couldn't find any, and asked if they could use ours and create this poster and actually mail it to policymakers. So we collaborated with them on that. And this is just from this year. This is a recent collaboration with SAGE, which is Advocacy and Services for LGBT Elders. And they used photographs from the project to create a guide about how to be an ally to transgender older adults. So we continue to seek these kind of nonprofit collaborations. We're donating the full project to several archives to be preserved for future research and study. And it's also informed Vanessa's work as a social worker, her scholarly publications. So this work, the making is complete. We're very much in the phase of still putting it to use in the world. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. There is more information about all of my work on my website. There's a separate project website for To Survive on This Shore. That's my email, which is also on my website. And thank you all so much for your time and attention. And I see that there are some questions, which makes me really excited because I want to hear everything you want to ask. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess. That is fantastic. And yes, we do have quite a few questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but we have some good ones. So someone has asked, what do you think the future of queer representation in fine art museums looks like?
That's a big question. You know, I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone. I guess I'll say what I hope for is that we expand what we think that means, right? That like queer artists get to make the work that they want to make, and that we can move away from some of this burden around education or representation. So for me, I hope that and I actually think it's happening. I see it in a lot of more emerging artists and younger artists. I hope that we expand what we consider queer photography and that we give people room to make the work that feels really meaningful and personal to them. And that we have all kinds of different stories being told. You know, I think sometimes people think the LGBTQ community or even the transgender community is monolithic, but it's so diverse and so varied. So yeah, for me, I just want to expand that. I want to see more representations. I want to see different stories being told from different perspectives.
Great. Someone else has asked, I wonder if you can say something about the relationship between gender nonconforming identities and the privileges associated with race and class.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that's something that I thought about most specifically with To Survive on This Shore. Obviously those things inform all of my work, but that work in particular, because it was so documentary and because we were so intentional about including intersectional identities, I was thinking about that a lot. And I think that's particularly important within the trans community. Again, thinking about it not being monolithic, thinking about how different people's experiences are in the world based on their race, based on their socioeconomic class, thinking about people's, safety, thinking about, we certainly had people who wanted to be part of the project but couldn't because of safety concerns around being out. And I think that is often increased in people who have other aspects of their identities that are marginalized in addition to being transgender or gender expansive. And then thinking more broadly about how those things affect access to employment, access to safe housing, access to medical care. So I would say in To Survive on the Shore, I was the most mindful of the ways that different parts of people's identities really intersect and affect their experience in the world.
Yeah. So let's see, we have two different people asking a similar question. Essentially, what are your thinking about your photographing your child, and thinking about what are your thoughts about consent in terms of your child. Someone mentioned, Sally Mann, and then just kind of thinking about, putting your daughter out into the world, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, in some ways I'm still figuring that out because it's so new. For example, I obviously show the work in lectures. I haven't exhibited the work in a physical space yet, and I have intentionally not put it online. So it's something that I'm still wrapping my head around and thinking about. Like I said, I do have one physical exhibition of the work planned, and I feel that I've chosen an edit for that I feel comfortable with sharing. But honestly, I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion, and I'm going to continually reflect on how I feel about that. Also, as she gets bigger, that might change. So I'm very mindful of the ethics around that and thinking about consent. And I guess I didn't say this explicitly, but consent and collaboration is really essential to all of my work. So that's very much embedded in my practice. And that is a bit complicated with my daughter. And I think I'm going to have to feel that out over time and see how that evolves as she ages. And, at some point we'll either participate or not participate. I think obviously Sally Mann is a reference, but there's a much more broad, rich body of work around that I'm aware of. So yeah, so it's evolving, I think.
Yeah. Let's see. Someone has asked, does your mother also see the work, especially the photographs with her in them, as being about gender and identity? And I said in parentheses, gorgeous work.
That's a great question. I don't know. I haven't asked her. I mean, she must on some level. I think we've talked a lot about how it captures our relationship. I think, she's obviously very aware of my gender and identity, but I think she must think about her own. I know we think about it in terms of how we're connected and what kind of relationship we have and how we exist in the world. So yeah, I don't know. I should ask her. She's super supportive of the work and she's always really happy to be in it. I think she defers to me in what I'm interested in. So and my interests have shifted. The very last picture I showed you from the summer where I was holding her felt like a notable shift to me because it's the first image in which I've been holding her, which kind of changes our dynamic. But I guess I don't know how she thinks about it in terms of her own gender. I think she probably thinks about it more in terms of her relationship to me.
Yeah. Okay, well, actually, we're going to end with this question, which might be a little easier to answer than the others, but where can people buy your books?
That's a great question. It's a little complicated.
Oh.
The first two are sold out. There are a few copies of To Survive on This Shore left on Amazon. Locally, you can get it, and also online, you can get a signed copy through Projects Plus Gallery, but they're almost gone. And then the new book, which will be out in January from MAC, you'll be able to get anywhere on Amazon and bookstores. It will be available in the United States beginning in January.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jess. This was fantastic. And I do hope that everyone who's comfortable is able to get the chance to come and see the show in person. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like, I encourage you to register to join us for an upcoming program on Thursday, September 23rd at noon, to hear curators Nicole Bridges and Philippe Peltier speak about objects that are currently on view in the museum's recently reinstalled Oceanic galleries. You can find that program and more at slam.org/events. And I know Jess mentioned there is something in the works with some models for a program in January. So more to come on that. So be sure to check the website if you're interested there. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.